Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business innovation and managing life. Please feel free to ask all kinds of questions about companies and research and personal productivity, any of those kinds of things. I'll do what I can to answer them. I see a number of questions saved up here, one from Thomas G. What are your thoughts on how a business can do high quality science? Companies like big AI labs seem to be doing well in this respect. They say, are they a good model for other companies doing science in other fields? Well, it's a question. High quality science should be distinguished from high quality basic research because somehow science can often be very directly in the line of a product you're trying to build. Basic research, sort of almost by its definition, is something that is much further upstream of an actual product that can be built. I mean, I know in our company, we do a lot of what one might call science. We're figuring out things about algorithms and math and so on, but it's things which, in terms of the character of what's being done, it's the same kind of thing that people would do if they were just trying to produce academic papers or something. But there's a very well understood endpoint, which is, well, we're inventing an algorithm for doing this thing that we need to do because we're building it into Wolfram language or whatever. That's sort of science in the service of products. That's a somewhat different thing from basic research, which is kind of like, let's figure out something interesting in the hopes that one day, perhaps 200 years from now, this will turn out to be something that can be applied elsewhere. So in terms of the science side of it, the immediately applicable science, I think there's an interesting issue that comes up in companies and in the doing of building of products and things like this, which is, are you going to do it right? Or are you going to do it the way that gets you to the end point with sort of least possible effort, so to speak? A lot of companies, I should say that sort of doing things right is a long-term play. It's not necessarily the best short-term play. It could be the case that it's more important to get something out there in the market, and nobody's going to care except the people who built it, whether it's really done right, or nobody will care for 5 years that it was really done right. Nobody will care until they try and build on top of it, whether it was done right. In my own efforts, running companies, I really like doing things right. And I think that maybe it's only the tail of the distribution of customers that really care about that. But I care about it as somebody leading the company. And it's something which sort of I take seriously, trying to do things right. But it's now the other point to make is that there's sort of if you say, well, I've got a bunch of software engineers and they're just going to put something together, that there's often a way to get to a thing that is, walks and talks like a reasonable product, just doing that without anybody having to do sort of science thinking about it. If they did science thinking about it, it would be done more right, but it is sort of going deeper than perhaps you think you have to go to make that product work. So this question about whether you sort of get depth of solving things or whether you just sort of skate over the top to get to the place you need to get to reach the next milestone for the next month or quarter or whatever else, that's an interesting question. And when you get to sort of go deeper and do things right, so to speak, I kind of think that is usually a feature of leadership. And it's usually a feature of, if leadership wants that to happen, it can happen. Otherwise, it can't happen. And if leadership really doesn't want it to happen, it's just like, get us something, as quickly as possible. And you have an employee who is sort of really trying to do it deep and well. Most of the time, people will just not like that employee because they'll say, why are you wasting all this time worrying about all this deep, detailed stuff when we just want to get this product out? So I kind of think it's a matter of sort of almost the culture of the company, the sort of the priorities of leadership, to say, no, let's actually try and figure this out for real. Let's try and solve the real problem instead of just sort of patching together a partial solution. Now, I think it's also the case that sort of this notion of kind of foundational thinking about things, sort of understanding what the root cause of things is, that's something that you may have a company culture where people do that a lot, or a company culture where nobody cares. In our particular company, we really emphasize that a lot, and it's done very well for us over long periods of time. But it is a thing where it's like there's this, can we really figure it out? I think partly there's a certain kind of intellectual confidence that's needed for people to think that they can really figure it out deeply. Let's say one is trying to build something that is a sort of product-oriented thing, and people are like, well, how are we going to build this? And sort of door number one is we're going to kind of read something from some paper somebody wrote at some university, and we're kind of going to hack together some solution based on that. Door number two is we're just going to figure it out for ourselves. We're going to just sort of dive in and solve the science problem so that we can get to the answer. At my company, for example, at our company, there's a lot of door number two that happens. In fact, much more door number two than door number one in that case. At many other companies, it's really door number one. I think maybe one of the things that is an issue there is when there's management for whom any kind of deep foundational thinking about these questions just sounds like gobbledygook. That's not an encouragement to do that. When management understands those things and kind of is into this sort of foundational solving of problems themselves, then when people come and say, well, we did this kind of deep thinking and figured out this thing, they're like, hey, that's really cool. As opposed to, why'd you waste time doing that? Why didn't you just, find some random thing on GitHub or something and use that? So that's the story as I see it for sort of applied, sort of immediately applicable science. As far as basic science is concerned, that's a really tough thing to justify doing, because from a pure sort of company point of view, it's like we're never going to get the benefit of this. We might be doing it for the good of the world. The world might be completely ungrateful, and what's the point of it for us? There's sort of a veneer of that's happened in sort of Silicon Valley in recent years of everybody's publishing papers. I kind of think that part of the reason for that is because that was sort of part of the techies take charge of people saying, oh, I'm working for your company right now, but I want to tell the world what I'm doing. So if I want to go work for somebody else's company later, it's easy for me to do that. And if you published a bunch of papers, it's like, well, this is what I did. So I think that was partly sort of the techies taking charge type move there. I don't think that's what's happened in that area. Now another thing to say in a different domain in life sciences, sort of publishing papers and getting your peer-reviewed scientific publication is important in building credibility for ultimately for things like, ultimately you're going to go into clinical trials and so on, but it's an important thing for building credibility. It's a known thing for building kind of credibility with investors and so on, particularly in the life sciences. I would say that hasn't really happened in more computational AI areas. I mean, people do crow a bit. Oh, I got this paper accepted in this conference, XYZ. I don't know how much effect that really has on the investment. I mean, some of the investment that's going on there is a bit irrational anyway, but I don't think that's had nearly the level of effect that it's had in the life sciences of, oh, yes, it was a paper published in Fancy Journal X type thing. But the most of those papers are not, sometimes it's sort of for the optics of, yes, we published this paper. It's sort of a certain level of basic science is being done for that reason. When it comes to sort of truly sort of foundational basic science, there are rare times in history when, for example, companies get to do that. And usually it's associated with a company that effectively has a monopoly on the thing that's being talked about. I mean, this happened with Bell Labs, it happened with IBM Research. Lots of advances were things like even probably the transistor were things which, Bell Labs could well tell would be of great benefit to it. It had the distribution channel. It was running the telecom infrastructure of the US and so on. It had sort of the infrastructure to take advantage of that sort of piece of basic research. And I think that's a common feature is when there is an entity that sort of has the infrastructure to take advantage of a piece of basic research and sort of nobody else does really, or nobody else does at the same level, then it kind of makes sense. It's kind of rational for that organization to invest in basic research. It's true at government, at the level of governments, particularly the US government, as the largest economy, it's the one that's most likely to benefit from some long-term kind of basic research stimulates economic activity type play. I think that the sort of the funding and reasons to do basic research are a bit complicated. I think in the case of our company, for example, I personally do lots of basic research, and we have a sort of people who work with me and so on. We now also have our Wolfram Institute, which is a separate kind of approach, which is not a company approach, so to speak, to doing basic research. But for my efforts to do basic research, I've just done it as a personal hobby, so to speak. Does it benefit the company? Is it something, I think a bit, probably. I think it benefits it actually probably most directly in the fact that it makes me a very big user of our products, and it drives me to say we should be doing this. We should fix this problem because I really want to use it because I'm being sort of pulled by sort of frontline basic research to do those things. But it's a complicated it's a complicated story. I mean, I think that if you look at sort of the AI companies and their quotes research, I would say the vast majority of it is pretty directly aimed at product development. Nothing wrong with that. It's a fine, rational thing for companies to do. It's a thing that can survive in companies. I mean, one of the things I've seen, particularly in long past years, is companies that are just doing fantastically well and have huge profits and things say, we've got to sort of build for the future. We're going to start a research organization. We're going to start a sort of moonshot research type effort. Those very rarely go well. They usually are, if they go well, they don't go well for the company that started them. I mean, the classic example of this is Xerox and their Palo Alto Research Center, which developed, user interface technology, networking technology, and so on. Those things did really well, but not for Xerox. Part of the reason for this is if you have a company that's done incredibly well, it's been incredibly profitable doing a thing, whether that thing is making photocopiers, whether that thing is making instrumentation for the oil industry, whether that thing is building, web properties and so on. It's got a thing that's done incredibly well. And then it says, okay, we're going to start this basic research thing or this research-oriented arm that's doing ambitious research. Well, the things that come out of the ambitious research, they may be things which one day would make a multi-billion-dollar industry, but when they first come out, they're not that. And it's really difficult for companies that are used to making billions of dollars doing some particular thing to say, well, we got this thing over here that's just sort of embryonic that might make $1 million if we were really lucky. How do we deal with that? The kind of the plugging in of those kinds of sort of, those innovations is rarely works. I mean, there have been some times when it's worked. I think the lithium-ion battery came out of Exxon, and I think they had a good mechanism at the time. I think they got real benefit from it. Maybe they didn't. I'm not sure if they got the benefit in that case either. Maybe I just don't know the history well enough. But just a lot of things like that don't get the benefit. Now, there are other cases sort of in the world of let's just give it away, which is much more true of software than other kinds of things. Bell Labs did that with Unix, for example, back in the late 70s. Unix was built to be able to do the software for telephone switching systems. And but Bell Labs really had no idea what to do with it as a thing. What were they going to do? Sell an operating system? They actually briefly made their own computers. I think 3B2, I think, was the designation of the computer they made. It was not successful. It was not a thing that Bell Labs or Western Electric, which was sort of the commercial arm of it, could successfully really make happen. And I think it just was not a fit with their giant business of providing telecom infrastructure. So I think that's sort of a trap. Now, I have to say, I remember many years ago, this is in what was the story I can tell? It was a company I was consultant for at one time, a company called Schlumberger, which at that time was an oil instrumentation company. At that time, well, was maybe mid-80s, was the world's most profitable company. And they were like, we're going to do basic research. We're going to start a basic research operation. And I remember talking to a chap who later on became CEO of that company about sort of how to do that. And I was like, I was younger, much younger at that time. And so I was kind of obnoxiously youngly saying, look, if you want to do this, because I'd seen this iteration a number of times before, I said, just put a bunch of money somewhere as an endowment for your basic research operation. Because, if the price of oil goes down, your vast profits are going to go down. And somebody's tendency somewhere is going to be to say, what's this, $200 million we're spending on basic research, that's eating into our profit margins. Let's just cut that. Nothing bad is going to happen, on somebody's watch when they're sort of CEOing the company or whatever, when if you cut this out, nobody will notice for 50 years or something. And the only way you can avoid that is to kind of have something which you've sequestered away as some kind of endowment for basic research from the company. And if you do that, what's the advantage? The advantage is you can then build a group of people who might be very impressive and useful people for kind of future things you want to do at the company. Well, they didn't do this. The price of oil went down. The people they had hired to sort of launch their basic research effort all left because the resources got taken away and so on. And I haven't really tracked what happened in the intervening 40 years, but I doubt very much, so to speak. And I think that's the thing that, one part of what I was saying there is also tricky. Like, let's say you have this wonderful sort of endowed basic research operation connected to your company. And let's say that accumulates lots of very talented people who do very interesting basic research kinds of things. Can you integrate that sort of those people somehow usefully into your company? It's not obvious. It's not obvious how you do that. It's in some places, my impression, I don't know fully the internal story, but at IBM, for example, they had a lot of, built up a lot of people in IBM research who, and then when IBM kind of pivoted from being a hardware company that was, where the real emphasis is just sell machines, to being more of a services company where the emphasis was sell consulting, my impression is that a lot of people from the research division were sort of pulled into that kind of consulting story, which was not an irrational thing to have happen. I don't know, but it kind of wasn't part of the story. Now, I suppose in that case, one of the things interesting there is the use of sort of research as a flag to fly when you're doing consulting. Few places do that. A lot of consulting firms produce a lot of sort of opinion pieces and thought pieces and so on, and white papers about all kinds of things about the world. But in terms of true sort of serious scientific research, I can't immediately think of that happening in consulting-oriented companies. I suppose it could happen as a, look, we can do all this cool basic science, so you should hire us to do these very practical things. I mean, the company that's probably gone the furthest along those lines is IBM, which has a very, very long history of kind of announcing sort of research level kinds of things, and then kind of using that as a flag to fly to get people to sort of pay attention and talk to them, so that they can sell, kind of practical consulting kinds of things. I mean, I think that happened dramatically with their Watson effort that came out of their long time projects in text retrieval and so on, but then was sort of flown as a flag, so to speak, to kind of provide sort of kind of air support for more practical kinds of sort of traditional kind of software consulting kinds of software services kinds of things. At least that's my impression. But so, it's a tricky thing because, if you look at sort of scientific research, and you look at sort of how it mixes with what companies do, one thing to realize is the motivation structures are sometimes different. I mean, at a company like mine, we get to do sort of serious intellectual, sciencey things because the products we make really can make use of those things, and because we make a sort of choice to do things in a foundational way, to do the science, so to speak, to produce sort of the best long-term products. If you have people who are like, I'm doing research and that is my thing, the usual endpoint of research in the academic tradition is papers, and papers are irrelevant to the production of products in companies. In fact, they're basically a distraction in my experience, and it's really something where kind of the thing you need to write to make a paper is just really different from the thing you need to do to make a product. I mean, in a paper, you can just sort of say, well, this is roughly how this works, and when you're making a product, the code has to actually work. It's a different standard, and it's more important in the paper to kind of talk about kind of the whole context of the thing, and produce all the references and all this kind of thing. That's not relevant if you're making a product. It just doesn't. It's just, I want the thing to actually work. Not necessarily for the paper, but the paper has to sort of contextualize itself within the scientific community and so on. Let's see. Let's see. The question from Dante: which field is cool as 1900s physics was? So, 100 years ago or so now, particularly heading into the 1920s, physics was really cool. Lots of stuff was getting discovered. Quantum mechanics was being invented. All kinds of things were taking off in physics. I will say that I think our physics project is the kind of 100-year rebirth of that moment. Probably in time, it'll be seen as, oh yes, that was a time when the 2020s were the next time when things really woke up and exciting foundational things got done in physics. When one's in the middle of these things, it always looks incredibly sparse. It's kind of like, a cloud in the sky looks looks like a very solid thing, but when you fly through it, it's not solid at all. Somehow, when you're in the middle of doing kind of things like science or whatever, that it always seems like it's going unbelievably slowly when you're actually in the middle of it. But looked at many decades away from that time, it's like, oh my gosh, that stuff happened so quickly. It was a thing that happened just now, so to speak. So I think we're in a cool sort of moment of a kind of as it happens, a rebirth of physics. But I would say in terms of the intensity of things being discovered, I think lots of things in the kind of AI machine learning area have had their moment. They'll probably have some more moments. It's often, by the time everybody knows about something, it's often kind of too late. The most exciting things have already happened. And it's sort of funny because when you're in the middle doing things, and nobody cares about it, nobody knows about it, but in fact, the most exciting stuff is happening. then by the time everybody knows about it, it's kind of the most exciting stuff can be kind of over. I will say that a thing that sort of in my personal history, I worked on particle physics, on cosmology, and the connection between those things in the late 1970s, which was mid to late 1970s, which was a time when those things were really cool. A lot of progress was being made, a lot of things were sort of being thought about for the first time. And so, I was a teenager then, and I got to work on these things, and I wrote all kinds of academic papers and things like that. And it has been something that has sort of at least been amusing to me, that the things I was able to do at that time were things that have survived till today. People still care about those papers that I wrote, and partly that's not because they were necessarily terribly brilliant, but because I was the first one who got to pick some particular piece of low-hanging fruit that had been made available in that field. And I think that it is the case that the people who get into new fields have a tremendous advantage. It also takes a certain amount of it takes something to get involved in a new field. If there's a field where the textbooks exist, you can go to classes, there's a well-defined institutional structure for the field, there's a certain less entrepreneurial kind of push that you have to get into that field. When it's a really young field, it's like, there are no rules. You don't really know you don't know what's going to work out. You don't know what's not going to work out. You have to use your judgment to figure those things out. And also often people will say, "What are you doing? I don't know what that's about." And so you have to kind of advocate for it. But I would say that the things that are being done, well, the things that are being done from a sort of engineering point of view in AI and so on are certainly important. That so far the science is challenging. A small number of people, including myself, have worked on that. I think there are all kinds of reasons why it's somehow fundamentally challenging, where the engineering is going to work, even if the science is not quite there. I mean, it's like when we look at something in biology, which was the result of, a few billion years of biological evolution, and we say, well, it managed to work out how you can get this particular cascade of different reactions and molecules and so on to do this thing. And yes, you can write a big, thick textbook about that, but at some level, sort of and it's useful to understand how all those things work, but at some level, sort of there isn't a big picture basic science about that, at least yet. And I think in the case of machine learning, it's not like the particulars of some kind of machine learning system have the kind of the weight of we're stuck with it because it's the way life on Earth works. It neither has that, nor does it have, oh, and we're going to make a big picture that has sort of a big arc of sort of scientific statement to it. It's more, well, you can go and study the details of how this particular machine learning system worked or not. I think, let's see. Question here from Going Broke, aptly handled there. If traders are dependent on LLMs for trading, do you see a Tower of Babel incident based on bad data? Oh, I mean, this has happened so many times before. I mean, it's been 30 years or so that there's been significant amounts of program trading where people in the stock market, equities markets, other markets, derivatives markets, and so on, are using programs to trade. In fact, sort of every quant hedge fund, that's what they do, is use programs to trade. And occasionally those programs will get into situations where they do goofy things. I mean, this happened many years ago, where there would be some signal that will be got from the way the market was behaving, and all these different program trading programs would all respond in the same rather pathological way. And what tended to then happen is the market would effectively go unstable. The folks running the market would shut the market down for some amount of time. I think that happens quite automatically on some of the big exchanges nowadays. And people would sort of unravel the issue and then go back and keep trading, and things would keep sort of bouncing randomly around, rather than, oh, everybody saw the wrong signal and did the wrong thing, and suddenly everything jumped by some huge amount. So I think this is not a new story. And in terms of the data, one of the things that is true about quant hedge funds and so on is that a lot of them really rely on the idea, well, quite a lot of them rely on the idea that history repeats itself. If there was some pattern of, this or that stock did this or that thing in this or that way back 40 years ago, if one's in sort of a similar configuration today, it's kind of going to work more or less the same. Not perhaps that directly, but there'll be sort of history as a guide to the now. And so one of the things that got done in the building up of some of the largest current, quant hedge funds is just a lot of work on really getting clean data, getting data from even very long ago, because because things would repeat. So data cleaning has been very important in that business. So, and I don't know in terms of whether, if everybody's taking their advice from LLMs, and the LLMs are all, I mean, this is of course one of the things that can happen, is sort of it becomes the case that the LLMs become the place where everybody goes to get their information, and then the LLMs are sort of feeding back on sort of that they're giving everybody the average of what the world has to say about things. And that's a funny situation where sort of everything kind of reverts to the mean, and it's and then I think that puts even more premium on, well, I've got something new to say, because everybody's used to the banal kind of sort of average of things to say. So but I don't know exactly how that plays out. I mean, there may be a long period of time when most of what's said is average, and maybe people are just like, that's good enough, that's fine, that's I don't really need to know anything more, spunky and notable. Let's see. Jamie is asking, if you were 22 today, what kind of company would you try to start? I would start a company where what it should do, what it will do, is something that I really care about personally. I mean, that's, I think the best companies are companies where the people who start them want the thing that the company is supposed to be building. I think that's maybe I mean, a subcase perhaps is where they want to do the thing within the company that they want to do the activity that the company has to do to build some other thing. But I think by far the best case is start a company to build the thing you want to have, and that's very different for different kinds of people. I would say that one of the things that's happened in modern times is that it's just become easier and easier to start companies, because so many things have become sort of prepackaged, off the shelf kinds of things you can get. I mean, in other words, back in the day, so to speak, every different sort of piece of the building of a company, whether it's, setting up your human resources function, or whether it's doing, setting up your computer systems or whatever else, you had to do that all yourself, and you had to figure out how to cobble all that stuff together. In today's world, an awful lot of those things can be sort of just bought off the shelf, or almost rented off the shelf. That makes it easier to start companies, and even the amount of investment you have to make to start a company. I mean, like, for example, the idea, oh, we've got to rent office space to start a company, not really a thing anymore. Not necessary. I mean, it might be a good idea, but it might not be, it's not necessary. I've got to buy the computers. Again, not necessary. Use a cloud provider or something. So, and I think also the level of knowledge of sort of what it takes to kind of think about starting a company has greatly increased. I mean, back when I started my first company, which is 1981, I I went and looked at some books on sort of how to start companies, and they were humorously bad. And they were, I remember the one where I just sort of like, I give up, was a book about management, where one of the main points, complete with pictures, was that the manager should have a desk that's raised up relative to how the people who are talking to them, where they'll be sitting, so to speak. And I'm like, this is just ridiculous. I'm not going to learn anything from this. The Now, that stuff all got much better. It got so much better that it almost became cookie cutter. People sort of said, well, you do this, you do that, you make an MVP, you make your elevator pitch, you do your seed, your series A, your this, that, and the other. Everything sort of got standardized and jargonized about how to start companies. And the fact is, most companies that are really going to be successful are somewhat bespoke. Some aspects are standardized, but I think it can go too far, where it's kind of like everybody's going to start a company. You just fill out, you make your ideation table, and then you're going to pick the top 2 ideas out of 5 ideas, and you're going to kind of make that your company, so to speak. And I think that sort of cookie cutterness of companies is rarely going to be successful. I mean, there are certainly interesting examples, even amusing examples, where people are my favorite, because I knew the people who started it as Autodesk, where they literally had 5 products that they had tried to make prototypes of. They took them to some trade show. The one that people cared about was the one that did CAD. That became AutoCAD, and the company took off, even though the name of the company stayed as Autodesk, because they originally imagined something that was a bit more like Microsoft Office or something. But that was a sort of that's a rare case. It's a rare exception in the sort of in the kind of just make a bunch of random ideas and sort of throw them at the wall and see which one works. I mean, I would say that well, there's lots of there's lots of history along those lines. But as I say, my main number one comment is, if you're starting a company, make it be a company to do something you care about having, is my overarching point, independent of the industry or the or any of those kinds of things. It's like it's got to be a thing you really care about. And also it's a thing where if you want it, you're going to understand something about the customers because you're one of them. Let's see. Ludacris asks, do you think AI will eventually come up with better startup ideas than humans? I mean, which humans? There are some pretty bad startup ideas out there. So by all means, you can expect that AIs will come up with kind of startup ideas where somebody did a this and somebody did a that. It's kind of like, oh, we're going to make an Uber for cat walking. Okay, there's people who do, well, at least dog walking, and there's Uber. I mean, there are now several Uber for dog walking services. They've been around for a while, but I remember when Uber and so on was first a thing, I was certainly making jokes about, when will there be an Uber for dog walking? Just like when television channels really opened up and it stopped being just a few broadcast channels, it was kind of a joke. When will there be a channel that's entirely devoted to the weather? And then there became the quite successful weather channel, so to speak. So, these things are somehow there are things where there is, given that you have an A and a B, there's probably an A meets B in the middle. And that's something that, yes, an AI can readily figure out. And I think sort of trawling what's out there to try and come up with new ideas, yes, that's a thing. I mean, there was a thing in the Soviet Union, there was an effort, it was called TRIZ. I don't know what it stood for, but it was a kind of a structured kind of everything is planned as one, was kind of the concept in the Soviet Union, the fully planned economy and all these kinds of things. So let's fully plan invention. And it was kind of a scheme where you say, well, there's patents in this area, and that means we can predict that there should be patents in the middle, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've heard people trying to do this even within the last year. People have told me they're going to do the same kind of thing. It was not very successful in that iteration. Can one come up with sort of ideas that come from sort of interpolating different things? Sure. I doubt they're the best ideas. I also would like to say again that companies really, it should be the case that the people starting the company are people who really care about the thing that the company is supposed to do. If the AI tells you, hey, what about this thing? And you immediately say, that's an amazing idea. That's the most exciting thing. I really want to spend the next decade of my life pursuing that thing. Great. I mean, in the model of did the AIs take over, that's kind of yes, the AIs took over. The auto-suggestion from the AI is leading the humans by the nose, so to speak, to go and spend the next decade of their life building some company or some such other thing. But yes, one can certainly imagine that happening. Let's see. It's a question here from Entropy. Do you see a future where blockchain tech is useful in AI? Well, people have certainly been trying that. I mean, I've seen a bunch of pitches for that, of things like, tokenizing compute for training of AIs, or tokenizing some training data for AIs. I don't know whether any of these tokenize X things has really worked out that well. I mean, the fact is that sort of the vast majority of what's worked, well, okay, in cryptocurrency, as opposed to in blockchain technology, they're slightly separate things. In cryptocurrency, it's really use the crypto as a place to store value. And just like you might buy gold bars to store value, that's been the main thing, plus sort of the inducement that it is something that's quite volatile and where you can be speculative with it and so on. I think that's been the main sort of thing that's worked there, more so than kind of the smart contract ideas and all those kinds of things. I think that in the case of blockchain, a lot of what blockchain sort of is it's just a ledger of what happened, and but it's a ledger where you sort of don't have to trust that the entity that's maintaining the ledger is trustworthy, so to speak. And the fact is that it's a weird set of cases where kind of you have something where if you're doing title deeds for, I don't know, for real estate or something like that, and your government is maintaining these things, well, you might not trust the government, but if you're in a place where sort of things are fairly stable, you're probably going to trust that the government is not going to cheat you on whether whether you own that piece of property or somebody else does. Somehow I can't help but remember quite a number of years ago now, I happened to be visiting the National Museum in China, and they have a giant painting whose caption was "The Burning of the Land Deeds." When Mao came in and so on, it was there was a let's just get rid of private ownership of land and just burn all the deeds. And I think that was different from what happened in 1917 in the Soviet Union, where that didn't happen. And then when the Soviet Union kind of dissolved many years later, people were like, I own that piece of land. So in this trust the government to maintain the land deeds, I couldn't help remembering that rather striking painting that sort of explained that maybe in some cases that doesn't really work. But in any case, I think this idea that you could have sort of you have these ledgers where you don't have to trust the maintainer of the ledger. Yes, there are places where that's relevant, where there are multiple sort of companies that are sort of in some space and they want to be able to make something that is that's where they sort of don't have to trust that one company out of this group But but the thing that really happened with blockchain, much more significantly than that, has been the fact that it was sort of a forcing function to rethink a lot of transaction processing systems and a lot of ledgering type systems. I mean, much as when sort of cloud computing came in, software as a service computing came in, it was sort of a push to rethink how a lot of software applications would work. This was sort of a push to think about, how should that work? And even today, you can look at, I don't know, the credit card processing system, which is, very ancient at this point. And in some ways, I mean, it works pretty well, but it's a little weird that there's the whatever it is, I don't know, the 8 second, delay or something for things to for transactions to be validated like this. I don't know all the details of how this works, but actually I know a fair number of the details of how this works. But it's, one might think that one could sort of modernize that, and there are lots of efforts to do that. And so, it may very well be that infrastructure is completely changed. But now, so the question was about sort of AI meets blockchain. And as I say, I've seen all kinds of pitches for this. And I wrote a thing back in, what was it, 2017 or something. I was April 1st, and I was, I don't know, on now I'm going to embarrass myself by not remembering whether there's a May 31st. But anyway, the day before April 1st. Gosh, I should know that, shouldn't I? I think there is. Anyway, I was kind of like, I'm feeling sort of like I want to write something. So I wrote a piece that I entitled Buzzword Convergence. I forget the order. It was blockchain, neural, quantum AI, or some other permutation of those words. And I kind of explained the interesting sort of, in a sense, intellectual similarities between those things, having to do with sort of ideas about how consensus is formed, measurement happens, those kinds of things, in all those different areas. And there's a wonderful similarity between those things. But anyway, it was I was sort of just waiting for the time when there would be papers and things and technology pitches that were sort of combining all of neural, blockchain, quantum AI, and that's now happened. And so you can take all permutations and you can even combine them all together. Maybe there's something I'm not thinking of here about kind of the I think in the case of, so one of the things people had sort of hoped for in the idea of tokenization is that, but it hasn't panned out that well yet, is that you could do things like say, well, I've got this little piece of data, like I've got some medical data about myself. I'll sort of tokenize it somehow, and then people who want to, make a more efficient market for these things. So people who want to aggregate all this data to train some model, they'll be able to sort of effectively pay me in tokens some small amount for the data that I'm contributing, and then to add some extra spice to it, do it in a way that's cryptographically secure so that my individual data never gets revealed, but only the aggregated data gets used in the training process. There's a chain of things that have to be put together to make that work, and it hasn't really taken off from a sort of from a commercial or other point of view at this point. But in terms of yeah, I'm not immediately thinking of a. I mean, I will say that the AI and blockchain have a bizarre similarity, which is both, at least at the beginning, needed GPU-like technology. The mining of things like Bitcoin was kind of at the beginning, before people made special purpose processors for it, was a sort of a GPU adventure, and that came about again in the training of AI systems, which is still, at this point, a GPU adventure, although probably when it's training specifically for the kinds of things that one is training for now, special purpose hardware will probably be the way that goes if it sort of remains stable enough for long enough for that to get developed. So I think it is interesting that the kind of I'm desperate for GPUs. People have suitcases of cash that they're exchanging for GPUs in parking lots and so on. That was a thing that sort of happened in blockchain days and sort of happened again in AI days. In a sense, it was more direct in the blockchain case because if you could do that Bitcoin mining, you could almost compute, I have this number of GPUs and I have this, I'm spending this amount of power, I will make this amount of money, assuming the price of Bitcoin doesn't go down. In the AI case, it's a bit more speculative. It's like, well, I'll spend, $50 million on this training run, and that will hopefully make me something that will go well. I think it's much more nerve-wracking in the case of AI training because things can happen. You can make a mistake and you press the go button on this big run and you've just spent $5 million and something went horribly wrong and nothing useful got trained. That's the horror case for people who are in that kind of business. Let's see. 10x is commenting on NFTs for real estate. Yeah, I mean, the fact is, it's really a question of if you want to prove you own this piece of real estate, most of the time you go to the government office that has the title deed or whatever, and you say, here it is. And in some countries where the sort of governmental structure is not so well developed or not so well trusted, it makes more sense. And there were a whole bunch of projects done, maybe, well, how long ago was it? Close to 10 years ago now. I don't know what's happened to those efforts, but people were very keen on the fact that country X had, put its real estate ownership information on the blockchain, on a blockchain. And as I say, it's sort of a good alternative if the government isn't doing its job to provide a stable setup. Let's see. Elsie asks, what's been my journey and lessons learned on financial investing, be it for necessity or returns or intellectual curiosity, and balancing it with focused R&D pursuits? I have a lot of friends who do run quant hedge funds and so on, including many of the largest that are around. And I think sometimes they're very confused by why I've never done anything in their domain, because we have the tools, have the scientific kind of a bunch of scientific ideas. In fact, people have used scientific ideas of mine for decades in various kinds of investing efforts. And people have been sort of confused. Why aren't you doing this stuff? And the fact is, I've just never been very interested in it. I considered in the 1990s, I considered sort of taking a little break and sort of doing some quant investing kinds of things. But I was in the middle of working on my big book, A New Kind of Science, and it's like I'm really motivated. I'm really excited doing the science. If I think about kind of figuring out, the details of how I trade this kind of option and how the value of that option or the value of this thing depends on whether some interest gets paid on this day, which depends on whether it's a holiday or not, and so on. I just couldn't get that interested in it. And I have basically almost never done kind of, I've never really gotten into those things. At one point a few years ago, I happened to get a bunch of cryptocurrency, and strangely enough, it arrived right at the time when I was working on a piece about why does the universe exist, a kind of very philosophical, foundational, scientific effort. And but I had this cryptocurrency and I wanted to sell it, but I wanted to do that in a decently optimal way. And so I kind of had this sort of strange experience. I'd set up this monitor with a bunch of sort of trading screen data on it, and I was sitting there kind of writing about why does the universe exist, and every so often glancing over to look at the price of this or that piece of cryptocurrency, and then sort of watching all these different depth charts and all this kind of thing, and trying to figure out, when I should sell this stuff. And I was proud of myself because I did really well in terms of, hitting the maximum and so on. I was very, and I that was and I think I was sort of personality wise, I think that it was quite well suited because I'm fairly analytical and can read plots and figure out things from them, and also fairly decisive. So it's kind of like okay, it looks like it's gone up as much as I think it's going to go up. I have some thing I'm going to sell a quarter. When it does that, I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to kind of worry about whether I'm doing it. Once I've done it, I'm not going to agonize about whether I did the wrong thing. So I kind of well optimized in that respect. But I have to say, it's just not my thing. I was just like, well, that's amusing. I made some money. That was cool. It was just like, I can't imagine personally finding this interesting. I can imagine it's a great kind of, if you're, I guess my personal interests have more to do with sort of feeling like I'm creating things intellectually. This feels like I'm doing things intellectually, but I'm not creating things intellectually, so to speak. The thing I'm creating is basically money. Now, I have to say I've done, I haven't done that much investing in recent times. I have sort of a simple principle, which is if, in the tech industry particularly, if there's some company where I kind of have been, I've investigated companies in that area because we've been buying some kind of product, and I've decided this is the one to buy it from, then I'll kind of, or if there's some company where I know, where I know a fair amount about what the company is doing and I understand its technology and so on, and I say I think this company is really doing interesting things, or sometimes where I know the people who are running the company and I think these are really good people who are going to tenaciously make things happen, come what may. In those cases, I'll invest something in those companies. And I have to say, I've invested in, well, many of the obvious top tech companies as a result of that. And then the question is, okay, so you invest something when the thing is sort of when it's easy to invest, something, and then you say, well, okay, it goes up, and it sometimes goes up dramatically and dramatically and dramatically. And then the question is, well, when do you sell it? And I guess one principle that I've had, which is probably, it's very simple-minded, but it's worked really well for me, is when I think it's sort of gone really high, I'll sell half. And psychologically, that works really well for me because it's like, okay, if I sold half when it was at some, and it turned out that was a peak and it went down after that, I'm like, oh, I feel really good. I sold half of it at that point. I did well from that. If it keeps on going up, it's like, well, I still have half of it left. I'm happy. And it's been a very good personal heuristic for me. I don't know how well optimized it is from sort of an investment theory point of view, but certainly psychologically for me, it's been a good thing because I don't have a lot of regret when I'm doing it that way. And I think, I've done a long time ago, I invested a bit in startups and so on. I did not have a good experience with that. I would say that the frustrating thing, I feel for my friends who are in venture capital and so on, because it's so frustrating. There'll be a company with a good idea, which sort of is doing the right thing, and then the founders will have a fight and the whole thing will blow up. Or there'll be people who you think are just like, how can I take this person at all seriously? They're just blowing smoke, and that company will do well. And there are companies where, it's really hard to tell what's going to happen. And I've been watching this stuff for a long time, and I think there's a point when companies develop. There's a point where when they get to a certain size, when you can kind of see the arc of what's going to happen, and you can tell a lot more. And many of the larger scale venture capital investors are really just they're kind of they're seeing how the wind is blowing at that level. And then it's, I think, much more rational, much more, I wouldn't say straightforward, but it's more, you have to be clever about kind of being able to sample the wind and tell which way the wind is blowing. But in order to make a play there, you have to be investing much larger amounts of money. You have to be investing really substantial amounts of money for that to be useful. At the point where things are really just a seed, there's some people I know who just say, I'll give a small amount of money to every seed that comes along that isn't completely crazy. And that might be a rational strategy. It's I like to understand things more than that, and so I'm going to spend a bunch of time trying to understand these companies, and in the end, it's going to be a lose. And I certainly had a bunch of bad experiences, maybe 30 years ago now, investing in startups and so on. It just like so eye rolling and so on, because it's just like you guys have a really good idea, but you're blowing yourselves up, or no, I'm not going to invest in this. This is just a lot of nonsense. And then you'll find out, well, actually, I should have invested in that because they managed to blow enough smoke that eventually something good happened. I think, plus there were cases where I felt like when you do that kind of investing, you kind of have to sort of watch things carefully because lots of squiggly things can happen. And if you're a serious institutional investor, you have a whole infrastructure for kind of watching that you're not getting cheated somehow. If you're just an individual investor who's not putting any significant time into it, that's a much harder thing to do. And you just don't want to be chasing, oh, you just cheated me, I'm chasing you. That's kind of not an interesting way to live, and not a good thing to pursue. Now, what I have done for many, many, many years is invest time in companies. And, I've been an advisor to endless companies over the years. And I would say that's been fulfilling, worthwhile, and a good investment all around. It's usually really, I would say that more than anything, I'm kind of a CEO counselor, so to speak, interacting with the CEO of whatever company it is. It's kind of often strange because I won't even meet ever the people who are the people who work at that company, even though I'll hear about them from the CEO, will sometimes say, "What am I going to do about this crazy thing?" And one can often give a good advice just by listening to what the CEO says about person X in their company, without it's not so much, well, what's actually the somehow the raw reality. It's more what's the interaction with the CEO. That's going to be what's important because the CEO is who's leading the company. But so I've done a lot of that over the years. And as a company, we've done a lot of tech for equity investing, where we're investing tech and access to internal expertise and so on at the company. That's worked really well. But the just throw money at it thing didn't work for me, and I haven't done it for a long time. And it's always worked well for me when I invest in my own projects, where when something goes wrong, I can see how to fix it, and it's not a question of trying to say to somebody else, "Wait a minute, I put my money into your company, and now you're doing the wrong thing. You've got to fix it. You've got to fix it." And they're like, "Oh, but I don't feel like it," or "Oh no, you're wrong. I'm going to go in the opposite direction." I have to say, with respect to companies, I'm just struck by the fact that I just noticed recently the first company I started back in 1981, it went public about 30 years ago. 30 years ago next month. It filed its IPO documents on the 17th of May, I just recently found, of 1995. So I was just looking back in a kind of walk down memory lane at the many bankers' boxes of documents that I have from that company. So it had an interesting, the company, by the time it went public, was called Inference Corporation, which sounds incredibly modern. And it was called that for a modern reason, although at the wrong time. When I started the company in 1981, it was called Computer Mathematics Corporation. And at that time, I was a young chap, 21 years old or something. And I was sort of doing the professoring thing. And I was like, I'm going to bring people in to help run this company, including one person who was had been a student with me, and who I sort of seemed like would be destined to be sort of a CTO type person. But it ended up I brought in some people. Sort of the theory was, well, they'll do all the business stuff. They'll raise the money. They'll do this. They'll do that. As I realized, in fact, just a couple of days ago, looking through these documents, I kind of got all upset because it's 45 years ago. So I can kind of, we can kind of, the end of those stories is now known. It wasn't like, it's like, and what I realized looking at these documents is, I suppose in a sense it's egotistically gratifying, but that wasn't my takeaway from it. It's like, if I look at these documents, I kept on, doing the right thing and following through on what I said I would do and saying this was the thing we should do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these other folks kept on doing the wrong thing, but worse than that, saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, it's going to be great, and then not following through. And so I was having a bit of a crisis a couple of days ago, thinking to myself, it's a very frustrating thing when you deal with people who are like, I'm going to do this, it's going to be great. And of course, it happens to one all the time. That's the bad case. The good case is when you have people, as I do it, I'm happy to say at our company now, where people say, I'm going to do this, and by golly, they get it done. And or I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. And then usually they get it done, but sometimes they don't. But that's okay, because it wasn't like I'm going to do this, I've got it, and then they fail to do it. But unfortunately, looking through these documents, there was just an unbelievable number of, we're going to do it, it's going to be great. Give us this thing so that we can do it. And then just complete failure. So that was not a good thing for me to find. But you might wonder, how did the company end up getting called Inference Corporation? Well, in 1982, the company had, I guess the seed round of money for the company, I should have kind of, at that point, I should have kind of, been pushier, because the seed round of financing for that company, I raised a large fraction of it, which shouldn't have been the way it worked. I should have just said, you guys can't raise the money, we're done. Rather than, well, I'll raise the money then, because that was a bad initial thing. But then by the time we were getting venture capital in 1982 or so was very different from the way it is today. It was all, for example, it was all based in New York. And it was, sort of high-tech venture capital was just beginning to be kind of a thing. But anyway, the venture capitalists that we had, who I did not, I wasn't the one raising the money from them, although I somehow was more involved. As I look at these documents, I was more involved in that than I remembered having been involved in it. But in any case, they were like, oh, this stuff about doing, things like mathematical computation, which was making money already. We were actually selling products and so on. It was, oh, no, that's not the way of the future. The way of the future is, 1982, the way of the future is AI. And so then so it was kind of like, okay, let's theme this company as an AI company. Now, what AI meant in 1982 was mostly so-called expert systems, which are kind of like, the idea was you go sort of interview an expert and you encode everything the expert knows as a collection of sort of programming rules. And it's kind of thing which we have actually made work now, although not in the form that it was tried at that time. But anyway, so that led the company to get called Inference Corporation, and it had a remarkably hokey logo that was an inference sign made from an equal sign and a greater than sign. But in any case, it was, I would say, and it really went under pressure from sort of the venture capitalists. It really went very much in this kind of expert systems direction. It did a number of interesting projects, which were kind of, sort of leading things of their time. But it was kind of a very much too early kind of play, although it's sort of fun in modern times that the name Inference Corporation just sounds like a company of the 2020s, not a company of the 1980s. So that was interesting, but it was I mean, I could go on at great length about things that I did wrong, well, actually, the th things the company did wrong, I could go on at much greater length about. But uh, I kind of decided after, well, a couple of years only, that that this just wasn't going in a direction that I thought was worthwhile, and so I pretty much peeled off from that effort, which was the right decision on my part. And then by 1986, I sort of took the experience that I had had from that, plus a bunch of experience that I had from doing, well, mostly strategy consulting for tech companies, um, and then started my current company in 1986 and made many fewer mistakes. I won't say I made no mistakes, but I made many fewer mistakes. And one of the things that I didn't do was we didn't have any investors. So my current company has never had investors in the nearly 40 years we've been around. And that has certainly made my life a lot simpler. And I think the things that we've been able to do as a company certainly more interesting than they would have been otherwise. It's I think yeah, there's this question here about R&D-minded that from LC might feel the pull of finance. Um, you know, it is a funny thing that a very large fraction of sort of people, quantitatively oriented folk who are going through elite colleges and things like this are going into finance at this point. And it is, and they're getting amazingly good salaries. And I I kind of I'm sort of disappointed by it. I don't know whether I should be disappointed by it, um, in the sense that I feel like it's you know it's a question of what happens in the world and what one feels about what's being achieved in the world. The question is, if you do things like you build software or you create products or you do scientific research or something like this, it feels like you're kind of adding to the overall value of the world, so to speak. At least, one likes to think one is doing that. So, and it is true that one's sort of building things which will be part of the tower of what makes the future, so to speak. It feels like in finance, that's not what's happening. It feels like in finance, one's just sort of spinning around with, taking advantage of the current situations and making money from it, but that sort of at the end of the day, there's nothing that builds to the tower of future for the world. Um, and one could argue, well, people will sometimes argue, well, all of this quant finance that happens, it's making markets more efficient. It's doing this and that thing. I don't really think that's actually true. I think that that's a very small effect if it's really a thing. I mean, I think most of what's happening is sort of intelligence goes in, money comes out. One's noticing, some little clever opportunity to make a loop of trades or something where there's where one can do arbitrage and figure out how to make money by sending money around the loop and so on, or whatever it is. One's figuring out one's turning intelligence into being able to sort of work the system to make money. Now, the other huge source of money is to be a middle person and to be part of somewhere in the middle of the flow of money, whether you're making a market, whether you're doing transaction processing, whether you're doing one of these things where the money flows through your entity, or even whether you're setting up some kinds of things like cloud services and so on is a somewhat similar story. But this is a thing where that is a way to being the middle person and perhaps smoothing. I mean, in that case, there is more of an argument that you're kind of smoothing things out and making things more efficient. But the question for me, which I have to say I've been very sort of exercised by, is I see all these very talented people going into this area, and should I be unhappy about that, or is that sort of a inevitable progression of the development of sort of the world? And you can kind of think about it this way. Back in the day, everybody was growing their own food. Everybody was kind of doing everything for themselves. And then sort of economies got more specialized. and people like me can go off and do things like build technology and so on, without worrying about growing their own food. And you might say, well, that's very abstracted relative to sort of the realities of life. And you might say, well, all this finance stuff is kind of just another level of the abstraction of sort of abstracting things in the world, and it can have its own motivation structure and so on, just like, oh, I don't know, building technology has sort of its own motivation structure. And from that point of view, it's just sort of part of the progression of abstraction in the development of things in the world. I don't know if that's a reasonable point of view. It doesn't, for me, perhaps because the particular point in the sort of abstraction chain that I'm most excited about is the one that has to do with sort of building technology and science and things like this, which is in a sense, a lower abstraction point. It's not as low as growing your own food, but it's not as high as just sort of moving the beans around in doing finance. Now, I have to say I've been curious about sort of understanding a bit more of the foundations of economics and so on to really get a better sense of how I should think about this. And so one of the things I'm hoping to do, it keeps on getting postponed, is to try and work on understanding more about the foundations of economics. I think that a lot of things we figured out with the physics project, and now with things with foundations of biology and so on, I think they have very obvious potential applications to economics and to understanding sort of foundational questions about economics. And I'm sort of hoping to be able to work on that. And I will say it has not escaped my attention that it might turn out that one of the sort of side consequences of that is, figuring out how to make hedge fund-like stuff that sort of leverages being able to figure out something scientifically about the economic system. And, for me, that will be something that I'm doing originally because I'm interested in the foundational kind of intellectual foundations of economics. But the effect might end up being something where I'm making a machine, so to speak, that is doing something that is from the outside not visibly different from what a quant hedge fund does, so to speak. So I think that's a bridge that I have yet personally to cross, and I'm sort of. But first, I have to try to understand sort of at an intellectual level some of these foundational questions about economics. Let's see, maybe one or two more. Oops, I've got to go back to my day job in a minute. Let's see. Robo asks, as someone who studied complex systems, what patterns or principles from your research do you think generative artists should explore more deeply? It's a very different kind of question. Thank you. Well, for a long time, I've been interested in kind of generating things from rules, things like cellular automata. Cellular automata make really interesting visual patterns. I would say that I have made them a lot, one dimension, growing with time, making a two-dimensional picture. I would say that here's an example of something I've long wanted to do. Not quite generative art, but sort of related to that. A cellular automaton is a completely deterministic system. It just kind of, you specify the rules, you specify the initial condition, it just does its thing. And it often makes some very elaborate pattern that looks, interestingly, very organic, very natural, very lifelike. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because I think that the foundational science of what's going on is kind of capturing the essence of what happens in systems in nature. So there's kind of this familiarity, yet complexity, that you see a lot in patterns made by rules like cellular automata. One of the things I thought would be really fun sometime is cellular automaton is a completely deterministic system, yet it does a lot of elaborate stuff. And you can even kind of, as you look at these pictures, you let them run for a long time, you kind of almost tell a story to yourself. Oh, there's this piece over here that's fighting with this piece here, and which one is going to win? And eventually, the red one wins out over the green one or something. and that sort of the epic battle is over type thing. I've thought it would be really interesting to be able to make a movie, particularly using 3D cellular automata, where you have all kinds of things happening and you've got sort of all these structures and they look like kind of spaceships that are coming in and doing things and blowing up other spaceships and doing this and that and the other. And you kind of, you move the camera around to show it from different angles. Maybe you put some music around it and things like this as well. But you're seeing all this action and all these things, and you're developing an emotional connection to these little things that you're seeing on the screen and so on. And then the reveal is it's a completely deterministic process. And in a sense, that has a lot to say about free will, because you can, if you're in a situation where you got emotionally involved with these things you're seeing on the screen, it's like, what are those pixels going to do? What's the voxels going to do? Whatever. And then it's actually, well, this was not a story, really. Well, this was as much a story as perhaps the universe is a story. It's all completely deterministic. I thought that would be a fun thing to do. I would say that the general, well, another thing that I've long found interesting, and this has been done a number of times now, is with things like cellular automata, you can make kind of mass customized art. You can make art, you could make a piece of textile where the knitting machine is running a cellular automaton rule and the scarf never repeats, or the fabric never repeats. I did this actually back in 2007. We had this thing called Wolfram Tones, still out there on the web, that makes algorithmic music. And that was kind of a mass customization kind of idea where I was sort of annoyed by the fact that my cell phone would ring and everybody else's cell phone in the restaurant would ring with the same ringtone. And I'm like, I want a unique ringtone. In fact, why doesn't everybody have their own ringtone? Let's mass produce customized ringtones by doing algorithmic music generation. So we did, and as it turned out, the craze for custom ringtones was kind of over by the time we actually got that properly deployed through the cell phone carriers and the complicated distribution channels that existed at the time. But anyway, that was kind of this idea of mass customized art, where sort of is something that I think there's more that could be done with. I think the thing that has been an interesting thing for me in recent times is when you're using an image generation system and you say, make me a picture I did a bunch about a cat in a party hat, it'll do that. But then you say, let me look at the internal embedding space, the internal parameters that represent where that image was in the space of all possible images, and let me move those parameters around. You get this kind of whole space of possible images, and some of them are related to things we can describe, like cat in a party hat, but many of them are in what I call interconcept space, the space of images that were sort of generated by the ideas of images that we humans have put out there, but they're not actually described by concepts that we already have. So there's this sort of vast interconcept space that can be explored, and I think that's in fact, a number of people now have made art exhibits based on stuff of mine from sort of that was generative AI in interconcept space, so to speak. I kind of think there's opportunities to do things interactively there. Like I've been thinking it'd be fun to have some sort of game type thing where you're navigating around interconcept space and you're trying to find sort of, can you get to the dragons in interconcept space, so to speak? How does that work? I'm not a game playing character, so I'm not in the target market really, although I kind of think it'd be sort of fun to see how this works to get more of a feeling for what's out there in interconcept space. And the sort of the takeaway for us humans is that the concepts we have defined and given names to are just this tiny fraction of all the possibilities of things that we can portray in this kind of visual interconcept space. So, and I think the interesting question that I haven't really probed in a serious way is the relationship between these computationally generated images like cellular automata and images generated by generative AI in like interconcept space. Sort of the merger between those things might be really interesting, but I haven't explored it. And I think that's another thing one could think about. I think that the very sort of well, and another thing perhaps interesting. Yeah, this is actually an interesting thing, not properly explored. So last year, I got all excited about foundations of biology and of biological evolution, and I kind of redid something I had tried to do in the 1980s, and this time it actually worked, which was evolving things like cellular automata to make sort of minimal models of biological evolution, where I have this very trivial kind of genome rule, and then I'm just mutating that rule to try and achieve some objective for these for the organisms, so to speak, the runs of the cellular automaton that correspond to the kind of development of the organism. And so I looked at what happens when you try and give certain fitness criteria for the organism, like live as long as possible, but not an infinite time. And you get a lot of very interesting kind of shapes and forms produced that satisfy some constraint or optimize some constraint, but which were created by this kind of adaptive evolution process. So an interesting thing that I haven't tried doing, but would be, I think, an interesting thing to try is make those fitness criteria criteria that are based on some of the things that might be sort of an idealization of aesthetics. So I remember like a mathematician called Birkhoff ages ago had a bunch of criteria, I don't know if they're any good, for sort of whether a thing is aesthetic. You know, does it have a symmetry? Does it have a this and that and the other? It would be perhaps interesting to try and look at kind of the have those things, Birkhoff's sort of criteria of beauty, maybe not his, but something like that, as the fitness function, and then just evolve these rules and see what you get, and see whether you can evolve. Is it a cellular automaton that is the fairest of them all, so to speak? And that would be another interesting thing to try. I suppose that I know a bunch of work has been done, I think mostly within companies that have been doing generative AI, of sort of trying to arrange the generative AI to make the loss functions for the generation be such that there's sort of a premium for some kind of aesthetic, good aesthetics. I mean, if you just take sort of all of the random, I don't know, professional pictures, photographs from the web and things like this, you've already got something which is very well selected relative to sort of just the random picture you would take. You know, I used to have this camera that I sort of clip-on camera that takes picture every 30 seconds. And, I take it to things like trade shows and so on. Many of the pictures it took were really bad. Those pictures wouldn't be in the typical training set for a generative AI system right now. So you've already got kind of an aesthetic leg up by training on things like professional photographs, and so on, things that people have chosen to put on the web. But one could imagine something where there is sort of an additional, I know people have worked on this, there's sort of an additional push to be aesthetic at the level of making generative AI. But I think there's a more direct kind of thing you can do where you get these images from things like cellular automata that are, to me, they're very, very aesthetically interesting images. They're images that have kind of a reminiscent of the natural world, yet they're not of the natural world. And they are complex, and they really, when you look at them, you're kind of drawn into them because you're trying to your brain is trying to figure out what's going on in this image. Yet they have a certain inner logic to them that you can tell there's a certain inner logic. There's, you can kind of viscerally tell that there's a certain inner logic to these pictures, and that's because there are underlying rules that are generating the pictures. So they're in this interesting intermediate space between the thing that has its precise logic and it all makes sense versus the thing that has the sort of complexity that makes it interesting. And I think there are all kinds of fun things to do there. I would say another domain that I did some stuff on, oh gosh, I don't know, 25 years ago now, is making 3D objects based on things like 3D cellular automata. That wasn't developed as much as it could be. I suspect that just like there are really striking 2D images that you can make, they're probably really, I mean, I have some, but they don't look that great. But of 3D images, that are either a 3D cellular automaton, you're taking a snapshot of the structure that you got at a particular step, or they're a 2D cellular automaton where you make sort of the time series of what it does. So anyway, those are a few ideas. If you come up with something great, send it to me. I'd be interested to see it. It's I think there's a lot of fascinating opportunities for making things that are kind of artistically interesting, and make use of both kind of this power of computation in the computational universe, and now this kind of interpolation of human artistic output that exists in generative AI and so on. And I think I have to go back to my day job, but thanks for joining me, and thanks for lots of interesting questions. And I see I never get through all the interesting questions here. And I often end up in rabbit holes that I hope you guys find fun. But in any case, I see a lot more interesting questions that I hope to address another time. But for me, it's back to the day job. So look forward to chatting with you another time. Bye for now.